I went winter camping in November of 2013 to test myself. I had been hiking and camping for years, but I had never stayed out alone once real winter conditions started to form. Somewhere in the Rockies felt right because the terrain was familiar and unforgiving in an honest way. I did not tell anyone exactly where I was going. That decision bothers me now more than anything else I did on that trip. The trailhead sat off a quiet forest road that had already seen a few storms. Snow lined the shoulders, but the road itself was clear. The air was dry and sharp when I parked. The sky was open and pale, the kind of clear that makes weather forecasts feel reliable. I checked the temperature before I started hiking. It was cold but manageable. I layered carefully, packed heavier than usual, and started in during the early afternoon. I hiked until the light began to flatten and shadows stretched long between the trees. The forest was dense enough to block most wind, which made the cold feel distant. I found a small clearing near a stand of firs where the ground dipped slightly. Snow covered everything in a thin crust that cracked under my boots. It felt quiet in a way that did not seem threatening. I told myself that was what solitude was supposed to feel like. Setting up camp took longer than usual because my fingers stiffened faster than I expected. I stamped out a platform, pitched the tent, and anchored it with extra care. The snow was light then, dry enough to brush away. I cooked a simple meal, drank more water than I wanted, and crawled into my sleeping bag before full dark. The temperature was already dropping, but I felt prepared. I lay there listening to the forest settle, convinced that the hardest part would be enduring the cold. Sometime during the night, the air changed. I noticed it before I heard anything. The stillness broke into a soft hiss that grew steady and thick. Snow began to fall, heavy and wet, the kind that clings and weighs down whatever it touches. The sound pressed against the tent fabric, constant and dull. I drifted in and out of sleep as the walls sagged closer, the space around me shrinking by inches. I woke fully when the tent brushed my face. The fabric bowed inward under the weight of snow. I pushed up with my hands and elbows, shaking loose what I could. The temperature had dropped hard. The air inside my shelter felt damp and cold, my breath visible in the headlamp beam. I checked my watch. It was still hours before dawn. I worked slowly, careful not to panic. I pushed snow off the sides, braced the poles, and retightened what I could from inside. The snow kept falling. It stuck to everything, heavy enough to drag branches down around me. I could hear trees shedding clumps of it, a deep thump followed by a hiss as it slid away. The cold did not scare me. Discomfort felt expected. What unsettled me was the sense that the forest had closed in, that the small clearing I chose no longer existed. When I finally lay back down, the tent walls still leaned inward, breathing with the windless weight of snow. Just before dawn, the snowfall eased. The sound softened, then stopped. The silence that followed felt louder than the storm. I lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, waiting for the first change in light. My breath slowed. The cold settled into my joints. I told myself that once the sun came up, things would feel normal again. When the light finally filtered through the fabric, it was dim and gray. I reached for my boots and hesitated. Something felt wrong in a way I could not name. I sat up and unzipped the door a few inches, enough to let in light without fully exposing myself. That was when I saw the footprints. They came from the treeline on the far side of the clearing. Each step pressed deep into the fresh snow, clear and deliberate. They moved in a straight line toward my tent. The spacing was even. The depth suggested weight. They stopped inches from the door, toes pointed directly at me. There were no tracks leading away. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make my mind reject what my eyes showed me. Snow was already drifting into the impressions, softening their edges. Whatever had made them had stood there long enough for snow to begin filling them in, then had not moved again. There was no sign of shuffling, no pivot, no retreat, just the approach and the stop. I stayed inside the tent, my body tight and alert. The clearing was empty. No movement, no sound. The forest looked ordinary in the thin light. Branches sagged under snow. My own footprints from the night before were gone, erased by the storm. Only the new tracks remained. I thought through every explanation I could manage. An animal did not fit. The prints were too narrow, the stride too measured. A hiker made more sense, but no one else had been out there that I knew of. The trailhead had been empty, the road quiet, and if someone had walked up to my tent, why stop there? Why leave no sign of leaving? I forced myself to move. I put on my boots, unzipped the tent fully, and stepped out. The cold bit hard, sharper than before. I approached the prints slowly, careful not to disturb them. They were human, boot prints, deep and clean. The snow inside them was undisturbed, layered gently, telling me they had been there for a while. I followed them backward toward the trees. They led straight, then ended. No turn, no overlap. They simply stopped, as if the person had lifted straight up or vanished. The snow beyond was smooth and untouched. The explanation came to me not all at once, but in pieces as I stood there. The storm had dropped heavy snow fast. The temperature drop turned the surface slick beneath the new layer. Someone had likely walked toward my tent before the snowfall intensified, then turned back the way they came. Their return tracks would have been covered by hours of heavy snow, while the approach tracks remained deeper and more defined because they were pressed into the earlier layer. What chilled me was not the mechanics of it, but the timing. Someone had come close to my shelter in the dark, during the storm, while I was trapped inside holding the walls up with my hands. They had stood there long enough to leave deep impressions, close enough that I could have heard them if the snow had not been falling so hard. I packed without delay. My movements were clumsy from cold, but I did not slow down. I did not eat. I did not sit. I broke camp, loaded my pack, and filled in the prints as I stepped over them, erasing the evidence as if that would undo the moment. The hike out was harder than the hike in. Snow clogged the trail. My legs burned. My thoughts stayed fixed on the clearing behind me. I kept expecting to see new tracks crossing mine, but there were none. The forest remained still. When I reached the trailhead, the road was empty. My car sat exactly as I left it, dusted with snow. I stood there for a long time before unlocking it, letting the cold drain out of me. Later, when I replayed the night, the fear settled into something more precise. I had not been alone. Someone else had been out there in worsening weather, close enough to touch my shelter. They chose not to make themselves known. They chose not to approach further. They chose to leave. That choice is what stayed with me. It was human, intentional, and unexplained. And it was enough to make sure I never went winter camping alone again. I went camping in early October 2016 because my divorce had just finalized and I needed proof that I could still handle being alone. The papers were signed on a Tuesday. By Friday, I had the car packed with gear I already owned, gear I knew how to use. I told myself the trip was about fresh air and quiet, but it was really about sleeping without another person in the house and not unraveling. I chose northern Wisconsin because it was close enough to drive after work and far enough to feel cut off. I avoided state parks and campgrounds on purpose. I wanted no neighbors, no lights, no rules beyond weather and common sense. I found the site by chance years earlier while fishing. It sat off a narrow logging road that had started to soften back into forest. No sign marked it. There was only a fire ring made from cracked limestone blocks and a patch of dirt where grass never grew. The road dead-ended a few hundred yards farther at a clear-cut that had started to fill in with saplings. The woods there were mixed hardwood and pine, damp in a way that never fully dries. Fallen leaves lay thick and slick, pressed flat by rain from the week before. The air smelled like rot and cold water. I parked the car out of sight from the road, backed in behind a line of brush, and walked the last stretch carrying my pack. I set the tent with care, staked it deep, laid out my pad and bag. I stacked firewood from deadfall and built a small fire before dark. The sky went gray early. October nights come fast in that part of the state. I ate without much appetite and cleaned up while I still had light. The first night felt normal. Cold settled in. The fire burned down to coals. Owls called. Wind moved through the canopy in waves. Around midnight, I heard a steady hum far off, low and mechanical. It sounded like a generator under load, not loud but constant, rising and falling slightly. It did not belong there. Logging had stopped in that area years earlier. The sound did not move closer or farther. It stayed fixed, as if coming from a valley or hollow. I lay still and listened until it blended with the wind. I slept in stretches and woke often, but nothing else happened. In the morning, frost clung to the tent fly. My breath smoked. When I stepped out, the woods looked scrubbed and sharp. I walked toward the creek to wash my face and noticed my cooler was no longer where I had left it. It had been dragged several feet, leaving a faint track in the leaves. The lid was closed. Nothing inside was missing. The latches were still fastened. No claw marks showed on the plastic. The track looked wrong for an animal. Leaves were pressed down in a straight line, not scattered. I told myself a bear could have nudged it and lost interest, but bears were rare that far south and that time of year. I moved the cooler closer to my feet and tied it to a tree with paracord. I spent the day hiking along old skid trails, keeping busy so my thoughts would not spiral. I saw no people. I found no fresh tire tracks. The generator sound returned mid-afternoon, faint but present, then cut out all at once. Silence after that felt heavier than noise. By dusk I was back at camp, cold already in my hands. I ate and cleaned again, packed everything tight, and went to bed earlier than planned. The second night, the woods felt alert. Wind died down. Leaves stopped moving. Sometime after dark, I woke to a pressure that was not sound but awareness. Something was close. I lay still and listened. Leaves compressed one at a time. Not rushed, not sniffing. Each step placed with care, slow enough that I could count the seconds between them. The movement traced a wide circle around the tent, never brushing fabric, never stepping on sticks. The pace suggested thought. The circle closed and then opened again. I kept my breathing shallow and regular, the way I had learned to do during storms. The circling continued for what felt like a long time and then stopped. No footsteps retreated. The woods held. I did not sleep after that. At first light, I packed fast. I checked the ground. The leaves around the tent were disturbed in a careful ring, flattened in arcs. Boot prints showed in two places where leaves had thinned. Adult size, work boots with worn tread. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to understand the pattern. I did not hear a generator that morning. I hiked out and drove to the nearest town for coffee and fuel. I considered leaving, but pride pushed me back. I told myself I needed one more night to settle the question. I drove a different logging road a few miles east and found another unofficial site near a beaver pond. It was smaller, tighter, boxed in by spruce. I set up with daylight to spare. I placed my headlamp and keys by my hand. I kept the car unlocked and pointed toward the road. That night, the generator sound returned. Closer than before, steady and heavy. It ran for hours. Near midnight, it cut off again. Sometime after that, I heard movement at the edge of the clearing. It did not circle this time. It stayed in one place, shifting weight, testing ground. Leaves pressed. I felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with animals. I waited until dawn and then left without breaking camp properly. I stuffed gear and drove until cell service returned. I did not go back for weeks. When I did, it was not to camp. Curiosity had replaced fear, and I wanted a reason that fit. I returned during the day with a map and walked the area where the first site sat. I followed the generator sound in my memory, tracing low ground and wind direction. Less than a mile away, hidden behind a berm and slash piles, I found a rough structure built from pallets and tarps. A generator sat inside, chained to a tree. Fuel cans were stacked under brush. A hose ran to a creek. The place smelled sharp and chemical. No one was there. The ground showed heavy boot traffic and drag marks where equipment had been moved. I reported it after I got home. Weeks later, I read a short notice about an illegal operation shut down in that section of county land. No names, no details. I stopped camping alone for a long time after that. The proof I needed came anyway. I had slept there, listened, and left when it mattered. The woods had not been haunted. They had been occupied, and someone had been thinking while walking circles in the dark. My friend Evan and I went out in late May of 2012 to test new gear before a longer backpacking trip planned for midsummer. We were both careful planners and used the trip as a dry run, not a challenge. The goal was to walk easy miles, check fit and weight, cook simple meals, sleep and leave. The area was public land somewhere in the Appalachians. I never knew the exact location because Evan had chosen the route from a stack of printed maps and older trail guides, some of them scanned copies. The place felt forgotten but legal, with no signs posted and no gates. The trailhead was a pull-off with space for 2 vehicles. The trail itself was narrow, packed dirt with grass growing through the middle. After about an hour, it faded into what looked like an old maintenance road. The road had been cut into the slope decades earlier, wide enough for a truck once, now narrowed by brush. The grade stayed gentle, which matched what we wanted. Fallen leaves filled the low spots, and the edges showed signs of erosion where rain had eaten into the soil. We walked until late afternoon and picked a campsite near a creek that wasn't marked on our map. We assumed it was seasonal runoff fed by snowmelt higher up. It ran clear and cold, with smooth stones visible through the water. The sound was steady, a soft rush that blended into the background. The banks were muddy in places, and we could see animal tracks from deer and raccoon. Nothing stood out. We set camp above the high water line. The ground was level, covered in old leaf litter and pine needles. We pitched our tents with care, checked the seams, adjusted guy lines, and cooked a simple meal. The air cooled fast after sunset. There were insects, but fewer than expected. The forest settled into the usual nighttime rhythm. Owls called in the distance. The creek stayed constant. I woke up once during the night without knowing why. The forest felt wrong in a subtle way. The creek was quieter, not silent but uneven. The sound would drop out for a few seconds, then return. It didn't happen all at once. Came in chunks like someone turning a valve upstream, then letting it go. The pauses were short but frequent. The pattern didn't make sense for wind or temperature. I lay still and listened. The silence between flows felt heavy. During one of the quiet gaps, there was movement in the water upstream. It wasn't loud. There were no splashes. The sound was a low shift, like water being displaced slowly. The creek resumed its normal sound, then cut again. The movement repeated, always during the quiet parts. I couldn't place it as any animal I knew. It didn't match the quick steps of a deer or the erratic motion of raccoon. It felt deliberate. I stayed in my tent until morning. I didn't sleep much after that. When the light came through the fabric, the forest looked normal again. Birds returned. The creek flowed evenly. The odd pattern from the night was gone. When we packed up, I walked down to the water to fill bottles. The mud near the bank held our boot prints from the night before. They were clear and deep, facing the creek where we had stepped down. Between those prints were other marks. They weren't footprints. They were long, smooth impressions, shallow but wide, like something had slid across the mud instead of stepping. The surface looked polished, pressed down in a continuous line. There were several of them, overlapping in places. I followed the marks upstream. They entered the water without disturbance. No claw marks, no toe impressions, just the smooth tracks leading into the creek, then disappearing. On the opposite bank, the same marks appeared again, angled slightly downstream. They crossed back and forth several times. Upstream, about 50 yards from camp, the creek narrowed. There was a small dam made of sticks and mud. It wasn't large enough to stop the flow entirely, but it could slow it. The structure looked fresh. The mud was dark and wet, with no plant growth on it. Water seeped through the gaps, then spilled over the top in uneven pulses. When the water pooled behind the dam, the downstream flow dropped. When it broke through, the sound returned. The pattern matched what I had heard during the night. The sliding tracks led up to the dam and around it. The mud there was churned and smooth. There were no large footprints, no sign of hooves or paws. Only those same impressions, wide and tapered at the ends. As we broke camp and hiked out, I kept thinking about the marks and the dam. Later, back home, I spent time looking through field guides and wildlife reports. River otters live throughout the Appalachians. They move silently in water. They build small dams or use existing debris to trap fish. On land, they slide on their bellies, leaving smooth tracks exactly like the ones we saw. At night, they travel upstream and downstream along the same paths, crossing muddy banks again and again. The explanation fit every detail. The interrupted creek flow came from a partially blocked channel. The lack of splashes came from an animal designed to move quietly. The sliding impressions matched otter movement patterns. Even the time of year lined up with increased activity as young otters learned to hunt. What stayed with me wasn't fear of the animal. It was how close we were to something active and unseen, how easily normal sounds had been altered, and how little it took for the forest to feel wrong. We hadn't been in danger. We hadn't been followed or watched in any way that mattered. But the experience stripped away the idea that quiet woods mean empty woods. We finished the gear test on later trips in more familiar places. I still camp, still trust my equipment, still sleep in the forest. I just listen more carefully now, especially when the water goes quiet in pieces instead of all at once. I went camping in June of 2021 because a friend canceled the night before and I refused to lose the reservation. I had planned the trip for weeks. Time off work was already approved. Food was packed. The drive was mapped. I told myself that camping alone was normal and that the quiet would help clear my head. I had done solo trips before, just not in places this isolated. The campground sat at the end of a long dirt road that branched off a state highway and narrowed until trees brushed both sides of the car. There was no cell service after the first mile. The road dipped and rose, carved by rain and patched with gravel in places that had washed out before. It felt less like a maintained access road and more like something left alone because few people used it. My site was one of the last ones on the loop. Past it, the road ended in brush. The area was dense with trees and low undergrowth. The ground was dry but uneven, with old tire ruts hardened into ridges. I parked, shut off the engine, and listened. The quiet felt complete. No distant traffic, no voices, even birds were sparse. I set up my tent in late afternoon. The sun filtered through leaves in thin bands that shifted as clouds passed. I took my time arranging gear, checking knots, making sure everything was squared away. When you camp alone, small routines help settle the nerves. I cooked early and ate while the light was still good. I cleaned up and locked food in the car. I walked the perimeter of the site once, more out of habit than concern. That was when I noticed a second fire pit. It sat about 30 yards away, just beyond the tree line that marked the edge of my site. I had not seen it when I arrived. It was not built like the official pit near my picnic table. This one was rough, stones pulled from the ground and stacked in a loose circle. Inside, a small fire burned low. No flames, just red coals and faint heat shimmer. I stood still and watched it. There was no movement around it. No sound of someone shifting or breathing. The fire looked tended, recent. The coals glowed evenly. I scanned the surrounding trees and saw nothing. The air smelled faintly of smoke, fresh but light. I told myself it belonged to someone at the next site. The trees were thick and sightlines were poor. Maybe I had just missed it earlier. Still, I felt exposed standing there. I went back to my site and sat near my own fire pit, which I had not lit. I watched the light fade and the forest darken. As night settled, the fire in the distance stayed steady. It did not grow or shrink. It just existed. I avoided shining my headlamp toward it. I did not want to draw attention, even if there was none to draw. I crawled into my tent earlier than usual and zipped it closed. Sleep came slow. Every sound felt close. Leaves shifting, insects tapping the tent wall. Somewhere, something walked through brush with deliberate steps. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon. I focused on my breathing and the feel of the sleeping pad beneath me. At some point, I woke and realized the distant fire was gone. The glow that had been there was replaced by dark. The forest felt heavier without it, like a shape had been removed but left a space behind. I lay awake until exhaustion pulled me back under. Morning light woke me early. The air was cool and still. I stepped out of the tent and stretched, then walked toward where the second fire pit had been. There was nothing there. No stones, no ash, no scorch marks, just flattened grass in a rough circle, pressed down as if someone had sat there for hours. The ground was dry. If a fire had burned there, there should have been some trace. I knelt and touched the soil. It was cool, undisturbed except for the crushed blades. The impression faced my campsite directly. I stood up and looked back toward my tent. From that spot, there was a clear line of sight through the trees. Whoever sat there would have had an unobstructed view of my site, my fire pit, my tent. The thought settled in slowly and stayed. I packed breakfast and ate standing. I considered leaving. The reservation was for 2 nights, but no rule forced me to stay. Pride kept me there. I told myself I was overreacting. There was no proof of anyone else being present. The forest plays tricks on perception. The day passed quietly. I hiked short trails nearby and stayed within sight of the car. Each time I returned, I scanned the area. Nothing looked disturbed. The grass where the fire pit had been slowly lifted back up as the sun warmed it. That evening, I stayed alert as dusk approached. I cooked early again and kept my headlamp ready. I watched the tree line as shadows stretched. When the light dropped enough that the forest blurred into layers, the fire appeared again. Same place, same size, same low glow. This time I did not approach it. I stayed seated and observed. The fire flickered once as if fed, then settled. Still no visible person, no sound. The distance made it hard to judge depth, but it looked close enough that someone would hear me if they wanted. I stayed awake long after I should have slept. My body stayed tense. Every sense felt sharpened. The fire stayed lit for hours, then dimmed slowly until it vanished again. I never saw it extinguish. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were not heavy. They did not rush. They moved in a slow arc around my sight, stopping, starting, careful not to snap branches. I lay still and kept my breathing even. The steps paused near the car, then moved away. I did not hear a door open. I did not hear tools or metal. Eventually, the sounds faded into the trees. Morning came pale and quiet. I did not wait. I packed everything with speed that bordered on sloppy. Before leaving, I walked once more to the edge of the site. The flattened grass was back. This time it was deeper, as if someone had stood there longer, shifted weight, leaned forward. There were faint impressions leading away. Not footprints, but compressed lines where grass bent under steady pressure. I drove out without stopping. When cell service returned, I pulled over and checked messages. There were none. I did not report the incident. I did not feel like explaining something that would sound vague even to me. Weeks later, I looked up the area online. I found references to people using unofficial camps just outside designated sites to avoid fees and attention. I read about locals who watched occupied sites before approaching to ask for supplies, money, or simply to see who was there. Fires built low to avoid detection. Stones carried off afterward. Grass flattened by hours of waiting. The explanation fit too well. I did not feel relief. Knowing what likely happened did not make it better. It made it worse. Someone had chosen that spot. Someone had watched me sleep. They had stayed hidden because they wanted to, because they could. I have camped since then, but never alone in places that quiet. I no longer trust the absence of sound. I no longer assume isolation means empty. In August 2008, a week before we left for college, 4 of us drove out to the old limestone quarry outside town. It sat past the last paved road, past the soybean fields, down a rutted track that locals used for dumping couches and washing trucks. It was private land, but the signs were faded and bent, and no one ever came out there anymore. We had been going since we were 16. We knew where the ground dipped, where the water stayed cold even in heat, where to park so the car did not show from the road. The quarry bowl held the heat all day. The rock walls trapped the sun, and the air smelled like wet stone and algae. Trees leaned over the edge, their roots exposed like ribs. We pitched our tents on a flat strip near the water, close enough to hear it lap, but far enough that the damp would not soak in. The fire pit was already there, a ring of rocks blackened from years of use. We brought folding lawn chairs from someone's parents' garage, the cheap kind with webbing that cut into the back of your legs. Felt like a last night of childhood. We drank what we had, swam until our skin tightened, laughed without thinking about time. There were no other cars, no lights anywhere. The nearest house was miles off. The quarry swallowed sound. When you yelled, it came back thin and warped. We left the chairs in a loose half circle around the fire pit and walked down to the water. We swam out to the middle, floated on our backs, watched the sky turn dark. The moon had not risen yet. The quarry walls went from gray to black. When we came back up, dripping and cold, the chairs were closer to the pit. Not knocked over, not dragged. Each one had been moved a few feet inward, angled toward the fire as if someone had been careful about it. At first it seemed like a joke. The ground was uneven. We assumed they had shifted when someone brushed past earlier. We did not check the dirt. We did not think about hands. We lit the fire. Sparks lifted and died. The smell of smoke stuck to our wet hair. That was when one of us noticed the cigarette butts near the tents. 3 of them crushed into the dirt with the heel, not fresh but not old either. None of us smoked. We did not bring cigarettes because the dry brush scared us. The filters were white, damp at the ends, pressed flat. The quarry had always been empty when we went. We told ourselves someone had stopped by earlier, maybe kids from another town, maybe fishermen. The place was known. Still, the butts sat close to the tents inside our camp, not near the road or the water. We kicked dirt over them and kept the fire going higher than usual. Dark settled in fully. The trees at the rim turned into a broken line against the stars. The quarry made the night feel sealed. Sound did not travel the way it should. When a rock fell somewhere up the slope, it took too long to reach the water. We heard footsteps after midnight. At first they were far off on gravel, slow and light. They paused. Then they shifted to dirt. We lay in our tents, eyes open, listening. No voices, no laughter, no car doors. The steps moved around the bowl, not straight toward us, not away. They stopped. Time passed. We thought it was over. Then the steps started again, closer, softer, as if whoever it was had learned where to place their feet. They circled the fire pit. They moved behind the tents. The sound was not steady walking. It was stopping, starting, turning. The steps did not fade. They changed position. The fire burned down. We did not add wood. None of us wanted to unzip a tent. The night air cooled fast and the quarry held it. Sweat dried. Goosebumps spread. We lay still, counting breaths, trying to make our bodies small. A shadow crossed the lighter patch where the fire had been. Not a full shape, just a darker shift against darker ground. The steps paused near the chairs. There was a faint scrape, metal against stone. One of the chairs moved again. We heard it this time, not dragged, lifted and set down. No one slept. The steps continued in short bursts until the sky lightened at the rim. When the first bird started, the sound stopped. It did not retreat. It ended as if the person had chosen to be done. In the gray morning, we came out together. The chairs were tighter around the pit, almost touching. One chair had been turned to face the tents. The dirt showed prints. Boot treads, deep at the heel, light at the toe. They went everywhere and nowhere, looping, overlapping, close enough that whoever it was could have brushed the tent walls. Near the water, we found a small pile of stones stacked on the edge, something none of us had done. On the far side of the bowl, near the trees, there was a flattened patch of grass and a crushed soda can, warm from the sun already. The can was not one we had brought. We packed fast. No one swam. The car felt far. The quarry felt awake now, exposed, like a place that could see us leave. When we reached the road, there were tire tracks that had not been there the day before, leading off toward the trees instead of back to town. A week later, after we had scattered to different states, I heard what filled in the gaps. A local man had been arrested for breaking into cabins along the river. He lived in a shed hidden in the woods, moved camps when people got close, watched places before entering them. The police found lawn chairs at one site, arranged near a fire pit, cigarette filters pressed into the dirt. His boots matched the prints they photographed at another quarry. He had a habit of staying nearby through the night, shifting position, waiting for people to leave. The place by the quarry was fenced the next spring. New signs went up. I never went back. When I think of that night, what stays with me is not the fear at its peak, but the care in the movements. Someone had been close enough to lift a chair without tipping it, close enough to choose where to stand. Someone had decided to remain while we lay still, and then to stop. July of 2019 was when it happened, during a paid wilderness survival weekend in eastern Utah. I went because my company reimbursed anything labeled professional development, and the course brochure used enough words like leadership and resilience to qualify. I did not care about survival skills. I cared about the receipt. 8 of us met at a dirt pullout off a state highway and followed an instructor in a lifted truck down a washboard road into a dry canyon that felt scraped out of the land. The walls were pale sandstone with dark seams where water once ran. The floor was sand and loose rock with patches of brittle grass. No trees, no cell service. Heat that stayed even after sunset. The instructor had us unload, mark a perimeter, and pitch simple shelters. Tents were allowed but discouraged, so most of us used tarps and bivy sacks. The course was meant to be uncomfortable but controlled. We were told water points, emergency protocols, and a pickup time. The instructor made a point of saying he would leave after dark to simulate isolation and decision pressure. It was framed as standard. The tone felt rehearsed, like something he had done many times. As daylight drained from the canyon, sound flattened. Wind slid along the walls without moving the air at the bottom. Heat radiated from stone. We cooked simple meals and rationed water. No one spoke much after dusk. Headlamps stayed off. The moon rose late, thin and useless. The stars looked sharp, too many of them, as if the sky had depth. I lay on my pad listening to my own breath and the small noises of people shifting. Somewhere a beetle clicked. Sand slid under a boot and stopped. The canyon made everything feel close and exposed at the same time. Around midnight, light appeared on the rim. It was sudden and bright, a white bar that cut across the upper wall and then steadied. It was too high to be a headlamp and too even to be a flashlight. It sat there, level, like headlights pointed straight into the canyon. No engine noise came down to us. No dust plume rose. The light did not sweep or wobble. It stayed fixed, as if a vehicle had rolled to the edge and shut off everything except the lamps. Time stretched. I checked my watch by feel, then by cupping my hand around the faint glow. Minutes passed. The light stayed. No one got up. No one approached the perimeter. The course rules discouraged moving at night, and fear did the rest. I could sense others awake by the way breathing changed, slower and shallow. Someone adjusted a tarp and froze. The light felt deliberate. It was not searching. It did not scan. It watched. The canyon walls reflected it back in pale bands. Shadows pooled where boulders leaned against stone. The camp itself stayed dark. I pulled my hat lower and kept my face turned away, not wanting reflection from my eyes. After a long while, a second light appeared beside the first, then adjusted slightly. The spacing looked right for a vehicle. Still no sound, no doors, no footsteps, just light. I tried to reason it away. A lost tourist, a ranger, a survey crew. None of it fit the hour or the silence. The road up there was rough. Tires would crunch. Engines would echo. Sound carried in that canyon like it had nowhere else to go. The light stayed for over an hour. My legs cramped. My mouth went dry. I counted breaths and heartbeats. The instructor did not return. The idea that this was part of the exercise crossed my mind and then fell apart. No program would stage something like that without briefing. No liability waiver covered unexplained vehicles watching students in the dark. When the lights finally moved, they did not turn off. They slid sideways along the rim, dipped once as if cresting a low spot, and then vanished behind the wall. Darkness rushed back in, thicker for the contrast. Sleep did not come. Dawn arrived thin and gray. The canyon warmed fast. Birds showed up like they had been waiting. We emerged one by one, stiff and quiet. No one joked. No one stretched with enthusiasm. The absence of the instructor sat heavy. Tracks showed first near the edge of camp where the sand was smooth. Tire marks, clean and recent, looped in wide arcs around our shelters. They did not cross into the center. They circled us like a fence drawn after the fact. The tread pattern was aggressive, off-road, with sharp edges still crisp. No dust had softened them yet. The tracks climbed back toward the rim and disappeared where rock took over. The instructor arrived late morning, walking down the canyon as if he had come from the road on foot. He looked tired in a way that did not match a planned exercise. His boots were dusty. His water bottle was nearly empty. He did not comment on the tracks. He did not ask how the night went. He moved us through cleanup and departure faster than the schedule allowed. At the vehicles, he did not linger. He did not debrief. He did not collect feedback. The course ended early. Receipts were handed out. We left the canyon under a hard blue sky that made the night feel unreal. I tried to forget it. Months passed. Work absorbed me. Then, in late fall, a news item crossed my feed about illegal nighttime prospecting and theft of drilling equipment on BLM land in eastern Utah. The article mentioned crews using spotters on rims to watch for enforcement while trucks moved below. Another piece described smugglers using canyons as temporary holding areas, marking camps without confrontation to assess risk. The details were vague, but the pattern fit. I reached out to the course provider through email, not to accuse, just to ask what protocols existed for third-party activity. The response was brief and generic. No acknowledgement of that weekend. The instructor's name no longer appeared on the site. The explanation that finally settled for me came from a local I met months later while traveling through the area for unrelated work. We talked about land use and the way certain canyons drew attention because they were hidden from highways but easy to access at night. He mentioned vehicles that would circle camps to see who was there and whether they would react. He mentioned lights used without engines to avoid carrying sound. He mentioned people who did not want witnesses but also did not want trouble. The tire tracks made sense then. The lights made sense. The instructor's silence made sense. He had likely encountered something on his way out and chose to remove himself rather than escalate. He came back because he had to, not because he wanted to explain. Nothing touched us that night. No one spoke to us. No doors opened. No engines ran. That restraint was the point. We were observed, measured, and deemed not worth engaging. The canyon was used by others for reasons that had nothing to do with us. I still have the receipt. It reimbursed cleanly. On paper, the weekend counts as professional development. In my memory, it counts as a lesson in how thin the line is between training and exposure, and how silence can be an answer when people decide you are safer left alone. In September of 2020, my dad asked me to take him camping one last time before his chemotherapy started. He had not been outside much since the diagnosis. He tired fast. He moved like his body belonged to someone else. Camping had always been our thing, the one place where he felt normal. We chose a state park in western Montana because the ranger said the sites were flat, close to the road, and easy to walk. I told myself easy meant safe. The drive took most of the day. Smoke from distant fires hazed the valleys and softened the edges of the mountains. By the time we arrived, the air smelled like pine needles and cold dirt. The campground sat in a wide meadow bordered by trees that rose straight and tight, trunks dark from old rain. Our site was near the edge, close enough to hear cars pass on the access road, but far enough that the noise faded into a steady hush. I set up the tents while my dad sat on a folding chair and watched. He gave advice he had given 100 times before, hands resting on his knees, breath shallow but calm. The ground was packed dirt with scattered stones. Felt solid. No slope, no roots to trip over. I spread his sleeping bag thick and made sure the zipper worked. He went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. The tent glowed faintly with his headlamp as he settled in. Soon after, the light went out. I stayed up feeding the fire. The night cooled fast once the sun dropped. The fire crackled and snapped, sparks rising straight up without wind to push them. The meadow beyond the firelight looked flat and empty, but the trees held their dark. Crickets chirped in bursts and then stopped, as if something passed through and pressed pause. I added another log and watched it catch. After midnight, the sounds thinned. The road noise stopped. Even the insects quieted. I was alone with the fire and the smell of smoke on my clothes. That was when I heard someone whisper my name from the treeline. It was soft and low, carried on a breath that did not disturb the air. The cadence matched the way my dad spoke when he was sick, slow and careful. Each sound shaped to save energy. I assumed it was him. I stood and walked to his tent, careful not to trip over the guy lines. The tent was still. I leaned close and listened. His breathing was steady, deep enough to fog the air inside. He was asleep. I stepped back into the firelight, a tight feeling settling in my chest that I told myself was nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time, from the side of the meadow where the trees pressed in. It used the same tired rhythm, the same spacing between sounds. It was not my dad's voice. It was thinner, stretched, like someone had learned the pattern without the tone. My skin prickled. I scanned the edge of the light, the trunks standing like fence posts. Nothing moved. I did not answer. I fed the fire until it flared bright enough to push the dark back. The whisper did not come again right away. Minutes passed. The fire burned down to coals. I considered waking my dad, but the thought of explaining made my stomach knot. I told myself it was a person walking through, someone who had heard us earlier and decided to play a joke. The idea did not fit the emptiness of the place or the hour, but it was better than the alternatives my mind offered. I took the flashlight and swept the meadow. The beam cut across grass and stopped at the trees. No eyes reflected back. No shapes broke the lines. I walked the edge of the site, boots brushing wet blades that soaked my cuffs. The ground showed no fresh tracks beyond our own, pressed deep and clear in the dirt. I circled back and sat, back to my dad's tent, facing the trees. The whisper came a third time, so close it felt like it brushed my ear. The cadence was wrong now, too precise, each pause measured. My name carried without effort, placed where it would reach me. I stood fast, heart pounding, and aimed the flashlight into the trees. The beam caught bark and low branches, then slid off into shadow. I saw a shape withdraw, not running, just easing back, careful to keep something between us. The grass did not rustle. The air did not shift. I did not chase it. I did not call out. I woke my dad by shaking his shoulder until his eyes opened. He was confused and tired, words slow to form. I guided him out of the tent and into the chair by the fire, wrapped in his jacket. I kept the light on the trees until dawn thinned the dark into gray. Morning came clear and cold. The meadow looked harmless in daylight, flat and open. Birds moved in the trees. The fire pit held cold ash. As we packed, I found footprints near the edge of the site, pressed shallow but wide, the heel marks clear. They circled the fire pit and stopped near my dad's tent, then turned back toward the trees. I followed them a short distance and found where someone had knelt, the grass crushed into a rough oval. From there, the prints led away toward a path that did not appear on the map. We left early. At the ranger station, I asked about people moving through the park at night. The ranger said there had been issues that summer with transients cutting across campgrounds to avoid the road. People who listened, people who learned routines. He said some of them mimicked voices to see who would answer, who would step into the dark. He said the flat sites made it easier to move quietly. He said it was rare, but it happened. On the drive home, my dad slept, head tipped toward the window. I watched the road and thought about the cadence of the whisper, how it had copied what it heard without understanding it. I thought about the footprints and the kneeling place, about how close someone had come while we sat in the light. When we reached home, I washed the smoke from my clothes and put the gear away. My dad started treatment the next week. We never camped again. I camped alone in Big Cypress National Preserve in February of 2015 because everything else within driving distance was full. It was the busy season, cool enough to keep the bugs down, and I had waited too long to reserve anything official. When I stopped at the ranger station, the ranger studied the map longer than I expected and finally circled a site, that sat off a narrow access road. He said it was technically accessible. The word technically stuck with me, but I had already driven 4 hours and daylight was thinning. I took the permit and went. The road turned to packed sand and then to mud that had dried into shallow ruts. Water stood in dark sheets between the trees. The cypress trunks were spaced in lines that looked planned, not wild, leftovers from old logging cuts. Their bases flared wide and smooth, pale where the water had lapped them for decades. The air smelled like decay, not sharp or sour, just heavy, like soaked leaves and warm soil that never fully dried. Every breath felt thick. The site itself was a raised patch of ground that looked firm from a distance and gave way under my boots when I stepped onto it. The top layer held, but each step pressed water up around the edges. I set my pack down and stood still for a moment, listening. There was no wind. Birds called far away, then stopped. Somewhere water shifted slowly, as if something large had waited and settled. I pitched my tent before dark because I did not want to do it with a headlamp in that place. The trees blocked the sky, and dusk came fast. As the light drained, the lines of trunks blended into a repeating pattern that made distance hard to judge. Things looked closer and farther at the same time. I cooked a simple meal on my stove, ate standing, and cleaned up right away. The smell of food did not belong there. After sunset, the preserve went flat and quiet. No traffic noise reached me. No planes crossed overhead. The silence felt pressed down rather than empty. I turned on my headlamp and walked a slow circle around the site. The beam cut the dark into a narrow tunnel. Beyond it, the swamp absorbed everything. The water reflected small points of light where insects hovered, then swallowed them again. That was when I noticed movement between the trees. Something tall passed behind one trunk and into the shadow of the next. It did not hurry. It did not splash. The water surface stayed smooth. I told myself it was depth playing tricks on me, that my light and the spacing of the trees made a normal animal look stretched. I had read enough about deer wading and birds roosting to explain most things. Still, I watched longer than I needed to. I shut off the stove, zipped my food into a dry bag, and hung it from a low branch more out of habit than fear. I did not expect bears there. I did expect raccoons. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay on my back with the headlamp off, listening to my own breathing. The ground beneath the pad felt spongy. Every time I shifted, water answered somewhere nearby. Later, when my eyes had adjusted to the dark, I turned the headlamp on again and aimed it through the mesh. The beam struck a trunk 10 yards away and slid across to the next. As it moved, it caught eyes. They reflected pale and steady, not blinking, set far higher than they should have been for any animal I knew lived there. The eyes did not move when the light hit them. They stayed level, as if fixed to a point above the waterline. I shut the lamp off and waited. My heart thudded hard enough that I worried it would carry. The swamp stayed quiet. No steps, no splashes. I told myself it was a bird perched high, an owl or heron, its eyes reflecting at an angle that fooled me. I lay there a long time before sleep came, thin and broken. Sometime before dawn, I woke to a soft pressure against the side of the tent. Not a blow, not a scrape. A steady push that flexed the fabric and then eased away. I did not move. I did not turn on the light. I counted my breaths until the pressure did not return. When the sky lightened to a dull gray, I sat up. The tent was streaked with mud, not splatter from rain. Prints, hands pressed flat, fingers spread. Some were low, some higher than my shoulders when I stood outside later. The mud was the same black-brown as the ground, with bits of leaf pressed into it. There were no claw marks, no fur, just hands. I stepped out and looked around the site. The water near the tent was disturbed, the surface broken by slow ripples that had not fully settled. There were marks leading away, not clear footprints but long impressions where something had pressed down and lifted again, keeping weight off the bottom. I followed them with my eyes until they vanished into deeper water among the trunks. I packed fast. My hands shook enough that I had to stop and steady them. I did not eat. I did not boil water. I broke down the tent and rolled it with the mud still on it. When I shouldered my pack and walked back toward the road, I noticed more signs. Cut branches, clean and straight, trimmed at a height above my head. A length of rope hung from a tree, looped and worn smooth. Farther on, I saw the ends of narrow boards strapped together and leaned against a trunk, long and scarred, the kind used as improvised stilts. The explanation came together as I walked. People move through that swamp on raised gear to keep dry, to carry traps, to check lines set where they should not be. Tall silhouettes that do not splash. Eyes high because the person is elevated, the headlamp mounted above. Hands on the tent to test for a reaction, to see if the site is occupied, to decide whether to move on. The evenly spaced trees made it easier for someone like that to travel unseen, stepping from shadow to shadow. By the time I reached the road, the fear had drained into a dull resolve. I drove out slow, tires slipping in the ruts, until the ground firmed and the smell of rot faded. At the ranger station, I returned the permit and left the story with the mud still drying on my tent. I did not camp alone there again. I camped in northern Arizona in March of 2017 to photograph the stars because the new moon lined up with a clear forecast and I wanted long exposures without light pollution. The site sat on BLM land a few miles from the nearest paved road. The drive-in followed a washboard dirt track through low scrub and scattered juniper. The ground rose slowly, enough to thin the air and sharpen the cold after sunset. The place felt open in the way high desert does, wide but not empty, with sound carrying farther than it should. There were two of us. We chose a flat stretch of gravel tucked against a shallow rise that blocked the wind. During daylight, it looked harmless. Animal tracks crossed the sand in every direction, mostly small, some larger, all dried and softened by time. Old fire rings marked where others had camped. Nothing about it suggested trouble. The sky stayed clear as evening came on, fading from pale blue to a hard black that made the stars feel close. We set up before dark. The tent went up fast. The tripod came out next. I leveled it carefully, adjusting the legs so it would not sink during long exposures. The camera clicked test shots while there was still color in the sky. The lantern stayed on low, enough to see gear without washing out the view. As night settled, the desert cooled fast. Heat drained from the ground, leaving the air sharp and dry. When we killed the lantern, the darkness felt sudden. The Milky Way stretched clean across the sky, bright enough to cast faint shadows. I adjusted settings by memory, hands stiff with cold. The first long exposure ran, the shutter open, the camera silent except for the faint hum of electronics. Wind brushed the scrub now and then, a dry whisper. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. The howling started a few minutes later. It sounded like coyotes, but it went on too long, drawn out in a way that felt deliberate. The pitch slid instead of breaking. It carried across the flats, echoed once, then answered itself from another direction. I paused with my hand on the camera, listening. Coyotes often called in groups, trading voices. This was different. The spacing felt measured. More howls followed. Some rose high and thin. Others stayed low and rough. The sound moved, not in a rush, but with intent. Passed from left to right, then behind us. I kept telling myself that distance played tricks in open land, that sound bent and folded. Still, the pattern held. The calls did not draw closer in a straight line. They shifted around us. The camera finished its run. I checked the frame, then started another exposure. I did not want to admit unease yet. The stars stayed steady. The ground stayed still. Nothing approached the edge of our light. The howls continued, now broken by shorter yips that cut in and out. Another sound answered them, lower in pitch, slower, closer to the ground. Came from the far side of the rise, nearer than I liked. We stood without speaking, listening. The sounds did not converge on a single point. They traced a loose circle. Each call seemed to come from a different angle, then fade. The desert amplified everything. There was no cover beyond the low shrubs and the rise at our backs. I imagined movement just beyond the dark, shapes slipping between shadows, unseen but present. I ended the exposure early and capped the lens. The tripod shook slightly as I folded it. The cold made my fingers clumsy. I could feel my pulse in my wrists. The lower sound came again, closer now, no longer answering the higher calls but threading between them. It felt like a response meant for coordination, not communication. We began to pack without words. The tent stayed standing, but the door went open. Sleeping bags got shoved inside loose. Gear went into cases without care. Every movement felt loud. Zippers rasped. Fabric snapped. The sounds carried, and I hated that they marked us so clearly. The howls shifted again. One rose from the direction of the road. Another answered from the wash behind us. The lower sound came from the side, closer than before. It was not a growl. It did not break into barks. It held a steady tone that vibrated in the chest more than the ears. I scanned the dark with a headlamp, keeping the beam low to avoid ruining night vision. The light caught nothing but brush and stones. No eyes reflected back. That made it worse. I knew predators often watched without exposing themselves. I also knew that coyotes rarely behaved like this unless driven by something else. We moved faster. The tent came down in one piece, poles folded and bundled with the fabric still damp from the cold. The camera went into its case without another look. I shouldered my pack and felt the weight settle wrong. Uneven. I did not adjust it. The truck sat a short distance away, a dark shape against darker ground. As we walked, the sounds followed. Not chasing, keeping pace. They shifted with us, maintaining distance. When we angled toward the truck, one call rose ahead of us, forcing us to slow. The lower sound came again, now off to the side, closer than before. I could feel the ground through my boots, the grit crunching softly. Every step felt exposed. We reached the truck and loaded gear fast, careless now. A case slipped and struck the tailgate with a hollow bang. The howls cut off for a moment, then resumed, closer, tighter. I climbed into the driver's seat with hands that shook enough to fumble the key. The engine turned over and caught. Headlights flooded the scrub with harsh white light. The beams revealed nothing moving, but they showed tracks in the sand that I had not noticed before. Fresh ones crossed the path we had taken, shallow and narrow, overlapping, too many to count. They angled around the site rather than through it. Some were small, some larger. None broke into a run. I backed up slow, not wanting to stall. The truck bounced over the uneven ground, tires slipping briefly before gripping. As we pulled onto the dirt road, the sounds faded behind us, replaced by the steady rattle of the drive. I did not speed. I wanted control more than distance. We drove until the land flattened and the scrub thinned, until the howls fell away completely. Only then did the tension ease enough for me to breathe deep. We stopped once to check the load, then kept going until the road met pavement and the horizon glowed faint with distant town lights. Later, in daylight, I thought through what we heard. Coyotes can coordinate. They can fake numbers. They can circle prey. They can be bold when food is scarce. In that season, late winter pressing into spring, resources run thin. The lower sound could have been a larger animal, a dominant coyote or a wolf moving through territory. The pattern fit animals testing, probing for weakness, keeping pressure without committing. The explanation did not make the memory softer. What stayed with me was not fear of attack, but the sense of being assessed, measured from all sides, in a place where sound traveled farther than light and the dark belonged to everything else. I still photograph the stars. I still camp. I choose sites with wider sight lines now, and I keep the engine pointed out. When the night stays quiet, I am grateful. When it does not, I listen and I leave before the pattern closes.